Hello and welcome back. So we just covered language, which gives us the ability to coordinate action through a shared background of experience. And now language is critical. Now, beyond just being able to coordinate action around leading, following, managing, and teams, think of where else in your life language is so important, right? Odds are in your job you have your own language. With your partner, your spouse, your family, your kids, right? There's all sorts of times where we just take for granted because we all speak English that we have this shared background of experience. So this other little tidbit of information that's important is to start being a little more present to the words you use. They actually are extremely powerful, and the more precise you are and purposeful you are with the words, the better and more powerful you'll be, the more ability you'll have to influence change. So moving on from language, we're going to go into the next foundational piece. So this is the last brick in the foundation we're building before we go into our core content on leading, managing, following, and teams. And we're going to start with teams here right after this. Before we get into this, we have to go into another thing, another common term that's used in this domain, and that's culture. Now, I'm sure if you've done any sort of professional development in the business world, you had trainers at some point say the word culture once, and odds are if they said it once, they said it 5 times. And one of the things, I was always one of the most painful students in class. The reason is I was always precise with my language, and if a teacher said a word more than once, and it was a critical word in what we're talking about, and I didn't know what it was, I'd raise my hand and ask, well, what do you mean by that? Well, it's only gotten worse. When I've ever been in any sort of professional development or any sort of training, if someone used the word, so say they were there to talk about sales, and they used the word culture 3 times, talking about a sales culture or a client-first culture, right? They use that 3 or 4 times. I'd raise my hand and say, hey, just so we're on the same page, what do you mean by culture? I'll give you one guess what I got after that. Almost every time I get a confused look. And then I'd get some stuttering, and then they'd spit out a whole bunch of words that generally didn't mean anything, which to me means they didn't hold the distinction of culture. They were just loosely using that word. But culture is absolutely critical to our behavior. It's absolutely critical to the effectiveness of our teams. And so if we're going to say, and I'm going to be saying culture quite a few times, I want to make sure that we have a shared understanding or a common background of experience around the word culture. So I'm going to create that with you right now. And on top of that, we're going to go one step further and give you some tools. So a couple things that you can be assured you're going to get with me is 1, precise language, 2, distinctions that are functional, and 3, formulas that you can use to take those distinctions and actually use them. So we're already going to be precise. Now we're going to go into the distinction. You already got one distinction, which was around language. Now you're going to get another distinction around culture. And then from there, we're going to go into a formula for culture change. So how do I change culture in order to have it fit my ambition? So here we go. Culture. What is culture? On the most fundamental level, culture is represented by groups of observable actions. So the key with this is groups of observable actions. Any culture can be described by the actions that can be predicted of the individual or groups. So let's talk about groups first because that's easier. When you talk about the culture of a group of people, it's always based on the actions of that group of people, and those actions are obviously observable. When you can start grouping them together and using them to predict the future actions, well, then you have culture. Now, you have all sorts of cultures out there. Right? You have cultures of individuals, you have cultures of groups, you have cultures of entire countries, and they all kind of nest together. But ultimately, it depends on the actions of that individual, that group, or that country to actually be a culture. Now, on top of that, as you see here, Cultures can be observed and described, but they can't be dictated, right? I can't dictate a culture. Now, this is awesome, right? So I'm the CEO of my company, and I have a series of employees. And if I go out to those employees and I say, we have a culture of honesty, yet every time that my employees interact with someone, they're trying to bend the truth, they're omitting facts, they're outright lying in order to get a sale. Do I actually have a culture of honesty? No, it depends on the actions. And I can't dictate it, right? I can influence their actions, but I can't dictate their actions. Now, culture also depends on the position of the observer, right? So my observation of the culture of my company is different than the observation of one of my employees, which is different than the observation of one of my clients, right? The position from which they're viewing the actions is going to change, which is going to have a different perspective on the culture. But ultimately, the distinction of a group of observable actions stays the same. Like, that's fundamentally applicable. Now, why is this important? It's important for you because you have a culture as an individual. We often call that personality. We might call it way of being. We might call it traits, right? All of these things are the same, right? They're all ways for us to describe or predict the actions that you're going to take in the future. And those are cultures, our individual culture. There's a culture within your family. A lot of times we call that tradition or heritage. But ultimately, it's what drives your actions as a family, and it's what others can observe of your actions as a family. How about in your workplace? Right? If you're in the middle, if you're at the top or you're at the bottom, it doesn't really matter. There's certain actions that you can expect above your coworkers, of your managers, of the CEO, if you're the CEO, of your employees, and of yourself or your management team. Right? And that's called company culture. So it really doesn't matter where you come from. Culture is represented by observable groups of actions. Now, when you think about this, like I said, culture is going to eat strategy for breakfast, right? I can set the best strategies in the world, but if the behaviors of the individuals don't line up with the strategy that I put out, guess what's going to win? Behavior wins over strategy every day of the week. So if you're going to manage or lead a team, you have to be very, very present to the culture of that team. You have to be very present to the actions of those individuals. And so when you're designing effective teams, designing the culture is going to be very important. So how do we do that? We're going to go into that with the culture change cycle.